Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me from behind the wall up here in Auckland. So what I'll do today is give you a brief outline of the work that we're putting together at the moment for around the land use scenarios and our long listing methodology for the transport program business case. I'll probably stop my video when I'm doing that. Waihiki's broadband can be a little bit iffy at times. What I'll probably do is, if it's possible, I'll just run through the presentation in its fullest extent. I am happy to take any questions during the presentation, but maybe it's a little easier if we actually leave all of the questions till the end. I'm happy to flick back to the slides when we actually get through to the questions piece. So I'll just crack into it. So the work that we're actually preparing is for the Metro Spatial Plan area. Now, to the northern extents, that's Taupiri, Huntly, Ngarawahia, and Ohenewai. To the eastern side, to Morrinsville, that wasn't actually included in the original Metro Spatial Plan piece of work. Cambridge to the southeast, Te Awamutu, and obviously the central Hamilton areas as well. So I've just included an area-wide map there to illustrate the extent of the work that we're looking at. Now, the key is really to try and ensure that we, for the first time actually in New Zealand, provide a cycle of land use and transport. We've tried this in the past, but it hasn't really been an established way of doing things. It is the way of doing things overseas, but this is probably one of the first studies that has ingrained and integrated all of the land use and transport into a single location. So it's an excellent piece of work. The criticality, obviously, is trying to ensure that we get a comprehensive and integrated approach to our decision making. This is obviously in regard to all of our future considerations for public transport, but also obviously to try and meet our climate change goals. So just a little illustration, obviously, as to the kind of aims that we have. This isn't obviously an extense illustration. It's just obviously the approach that we're trying to take in terms of trying to help build demand for public transport, and then obviously ensure that we have sufficient outcomes for that transport system. In terms of the land use, we obviously have been provided with the Metro Spatial Plan outcomes. Those were completed during 2019-2020. And as part of that, we're trying to ensure that we're testing sufficient scenarios that give us the best fit with our transit concepts. So obviously what we're trying to do here is obviously first and foremost test the MSP land use pattern, but we're also going to look at two other scenarios, which looks at potentially divergent development responses within a central core idea, and then obviously how we would then look at the sequencing and phasing. We also have a regional focused land use scenario as well. To note as well that as part of the Metro Spatial Plan, the NIDIA high growth scenario has now been used. Previously, NIDIA low growth scenario was agreed as part of the Metro Spatial Plan. Now that's all been agreed through the Future Proof Partnership. What that means actually is just the pattern to which we expect growth to be forecast for the future. And so what we have is an approximate population of around about 550,000 within the Future Proof Metro Spatial Plan area. As I said before, there's three main land use tests, and actually the fourth one is the counterfactual piece. So that's really what would happen to land use and transport if we just continued with a business as usual development scenario, and that will be the baseline for any of the future testing, to ensure that obviously what we're trying to achieve here is something that provides us both the best look at a compact urban form, but also the best look at the transit oriented outcomes we can also deliver. So those four land use scenarios you see there, those are the slides you'll see next. So from the point of view of the demand that we have in here, obviously the first component of demand is residential. And then the second there, just in the bottom left corner, you can see is the employment piece. So the way in which this has been developed is land use test 0 is the counterfactual. That's obviously what would occur if we just stuck with business as usual, as I said. And then land use test 1, this is the outcome from the MSP data. You can just see the map there on the right-hand side here is Cambridge, Tiamutu in the south, Taupri, Narawa here in the northern part there. And then obviously that main metropolitan area of Hamilton within the centre. So as part of the MSP work, obviously this was derived in partnership with all of the future-proof partners, and this was obviously the land use change and development expectation that was put in place in 1920. What we've obviously looked at is when you put the overlay of the transport modes in place, what we're trying to do is test service or demand-driven outcomes to try and consider what the land use might need to be to support a greater level of public transport shift. So you've got there is the more centralized focus. This is building upon work that's been done by the National Policy Statement for Urban Development. That's being led in Hamilton City Council by Paul Berman now, and obviously previously by Luke O'Dwyer. And what that work really was looking at is around a number of key areas within the eastern and central side of Hamilton. We're building upon that somewhat and actually trying to extend or to increase the amount of infill that we have within the metropolitan area to try and give a strong urban core. And then the third test there, this is where we might consider a more regional focus, and obviously in the next slide I'll now just give you some ideas of exactly what that looks like. So again, as the counterfactual, that's just obviously the prior land uses. This has all been derived from the previous WRTM model, the WRTM Waikato Regional Transport Model, and that work has been previously completed, and we will just use it as the baseline. The MSP data set here, as you see, is Hamilton carried 70% of the population increase in residential, which actually incorporated 17% of intensification of existing areas within Hamilton, and what basically was termed as a city expansion, so newer areas within Hamilton City Council boundaries, around 83%, and then the regional nodes, Cambridge, Morrinsville, Ngaruahia, and Tiamutu, obviously around 30%. What we've done is consider what that central test therefore might look to try and achieve. And therefore what we've done is consider a scenario whereby we would actually look to try and put 70% into an intensification of that land and actually only expand the city by 30%, whilst maintaining a regional growth of 30% again. In land use 3, obviously with a regional focus, this is trying to test the extremes of the land use types that we might want to actually look at. It's around actually then developing only 40% within Hamilton itself, 30% of that being city expansion, maintaining that 70% within the urban core of Hamilton, and then considering what would be the effect of then if you had a further 30% of regional growth in Cambridge, in Tiamutu, in Morrinsville, and up as high as Ohinawai. And the reason for doing that, obviously, is to try and ensure that what we're doing is testing the land use and the transport in the same cycle. So we're actually trying to ensure that the cycle feeds one another. So the transport mode, as you open it up, provides you an opportunity to actually develop, and vice versa. The change in land use obviously will drive you towards a transport outcome. So the way in which we've done that is chosen a 5-layer approach, and these aren't necessarily listed in any form of importance. These are just literally a 1 through 5 list. So those lists are the micromobility, which is including walking and cycling. And first and foremost, that's traditionally been a 1 to 3 kilometer distance from key destinations. Obviously, with the advent of e-bikes, what we're doing is expanding that up towards 6 kilometers. And obviously, the Waikato itself has a very strong opportunity here because of the flat nature of the land and the ability, therefore, to provide for a 6 kilometer distance being easily achieved. Then what we've got is layer 2 is the transit spine services. That's the idea around rail rapid transit, and that being a core set of services. They may not be multiple but there may be a series of those that actually are derived. And then what you've got there is then the supporting bus network and local buses. So frequent bus services and local bus services that actually will support that spine service. The fourth layer being freight, we'll consider, and again in a couple of slides I'll show you this, the idea around freight to rail being an option, and obviously then the consideration of where the actual freight needs to or doesn't need to be within the city extents themselves, the idea of servicing times, provision of freight hubs and freight lanes as required. And then the fifth layer being demand management, really looking at the effects on parking that parking changes may have to the network, and optimization of that existing series of roads and hierarchies, particularly with the advent of the opening of the Expressway. That's going to have a considerable impact upon the reallocation of traffic around the region, and it may particularly have an impact upon YPA's traffic, particularly around State Highway 3. So I think that's one of those areas where we could be looking at exactly where the actual reallocation of transport will come from. And just a couple of notes here, we'll be looking at considerations around possibly, if we are building spine services or for rapid transit, looking at park and ride considerations in some of those furthest extents such as Tiamutu or Morrinsville, and considering obviously what are the key destinations in all of those regional areas that we need to actually provide for, so schools, hospitals, interregional transport trips. So this is just an overlay of, I guess, a series of what the long list will look like. So the long list itself is obviously a series of networks which will help provide the transport modes, and those networks, as I say, of those 5 layers, the walking and cycling, rapid transit, etc. So the way in which those start to look is, this is the bus network here, which is talking around the existing proposed 25 network. This is provided by Waikato Regional Council, and it's looking towards a demand-driven series of bus services, and this is likely to be implemented prior to 2025. One of then the main tests obviously we'll be looking at is around a heavy rail system, using the existing corridors, and what that might mean in terms of investment, and what that might mean in terms of demand that could be needed to actually justify the use of that particular network, and obviously the costs associated with getting particularly a series of those networks up to actual standards. So certainly for the Cambridge line, that would obviously have to include an extension to the line that was already been disestablished, and what impact that might have. So that's not necessarily just impact on demand, that's also impact upon the urban form as well. So quite a considerable number of issues as you come down Victoria Road into Cambridge around that particular designation being so narrow, and obviously being so close to the edge of the existing highway. On that particular alignment, we'd also look at a much more compact element, which would be a light rail or bus rapid transit option, which provides you with a numerous number of stops, rather than heavy rail, which obviously have stops much further apart. And then just looking at the rapid transit spines, just for an example, we've just put a couple of the possibilities on the list here. And this is looking at whether or not we can derive a rapid transit corridor that runs basically between Ngaruahia down through Te Rapa Road and into the centre of the city, out to Ruakura University, out via Tamahiri. And then what we're looking at there is the feasibility of pushing that all the way to Cambridge, or considering the possibility of express bus services that would run between Cambridge and Tamahiri. Similarly, services that would run between the airport or further south and Tiamutu, and similarly from Ruakura out towards Morrinsville. So the dotted lines there are just alternatives to the possible theme as well. So this is obviously a work in progress. I'm really just outlining the methodology that we're looking at this moment in time. These are not necessarily definitive outcomes at this point in time, but by the end of this month, we will have actually derived all of the long list options that we're trying to get. The kind of thing that might look like is often around what are the existing pieces of network that we can actually adapt, or what are the possibilities of providing new pieces of infrastructure. So a heavy focus on this as part of our delivery will be understanding the effect on climate change, and therefore what parts of the existing network could be reused, but certainly from a design, form and function point of view, to provide for these kind of services, such as here you've got a bus rapid transit corridor. We would certainly need to be looking at a 34-meter corridor to provide for the transport needs, and that's providing you your walking and cycling being as a segregated set of services, bus lanes, standard driving lanes, and obviously the walking and cycling, and then the provision for services such as obviously your stations, and then obviously street planting, etc. So we are trying to ensure that obviously the urban design and the urban form will meet the requirements that the local and regional requirements are needed. So just a couple of options there. One of the big questions is obviously if this is a land use outcome that looks around 100 years. We're not trying to consider these particular options such as the heavy rail to the east in anything in the short term, but we have to derive short to medium term and then very long term outcomes to try and meet that 100-year vision. So with this, the idea was that we would try and fit in with the H2A, which the Hamilton to Auckland rail business case that was delivered late last year or early this year, which considered a series of options around a connection between Hamilton and Auckland on a rapid rail system. And those options looked at either using the existing corridor or existing rail line, up to Auckland, or looked at a series of options that actually had new infrastructure in place that connected Hamilton to Auckland. So what we're looking at here is, if that were to be something that would be progressing, we would look at obviously trying to derive an outcome that would have an eastern rail system around Hamilton, and what that impact would have around passenger or freight opportunities, what that would mean for Cambridge and Te Awamutu, and ultimately what that would mean also for connections to Tauranga, and also to the Northern Trunk line. So the reason for doing that is obviously a significant opportunity is to move a lot of freight to rail, and the idea is that certainly by 2050 MOT has set a target of up to 20%, and I think for the Waikato we may actually be considering that to be 20 to 30% in terms of the amount of freight to rail. So here I've just obviously talked around a couple of the issues around the existing rail line, certainly between Hamilton and Ruakura. That 7-kilometre stretch is a very narrow single gauge. Obviously you're all aware the line out to Cambridge obviously stops close to the Frontiera milk factory and doesn't extend into Cambridge any longer. But it is part of a network that provides already existing amount of freight movement, and I know the Frontiera probably are looking at extending that service and actually getting more of their milk product onto rail in the future. So really that's the consideration of what would happen in the very long term if we looked at possibly providing an eastern rail connection pardon me, that also would look at possibly having new passenger services on it, and therefore possibly even having a new passenger station out towards the eastern side of Hamilton. Incorporating all of this, of course, would be, if you did do that, there would be a series of those lines that may actually not require any rail to run it on the future. Now, Kiwi Rail doesn't divest any land, but they may actually be part of any consideration going forward around reutilisation of those corridors for other modes. So that's something that we'll be looking at as well. So you'll note there, note 7, which is around the possibility of therefore repurposing the rail bridge across the Waikato in Hamilton, close to Clauden's Bridge, as possibly having that as a walking and cycling opportunity. But again, these are a series of things that are coming through as part of the options for our long listing.
James, Graham Webber here, Cambridge Council. The designation from Hautapu right into Cambridge has been retained by Kiwi Rail. It's there for the future. It's currently a walkway, cycleway, but they can in the future bring that into action. Sorry, just thought I'd let you know.
Perfect. Yes, thank you very much indeed. Yes, actually, Brian and I were chatting about that yesterday, and I think it's one of those things where KiwiRail could very much be a strong partner to the region, as a series of those discussions, opportunities, as it were.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. So just to quickly tie off that idea around the freight scenarios, obviously with the inland port at Horatu, the future inland port here at Ruakura, and we were considering the possibility of there being an inland port or freight distribution hub down in Peacocks or the airport. And the reason for this again is to try and derive what are our future tests for freight, and obviously what that would look like, therefore, as an outcome for the internal part of Hamilton. So this is quite Hamilton centric, this particular piece, but certainly if you were to go around Hamilton in this regard, the internal corridors might well be an opportunity for reuse or mode changes along them, and obviously has a lot of land within the centre of Hamilton itself. So as Councillor Webber mentioned, there are opportunities moving forward if that were to occur. So what's a long list? So a long list basically is all of our land use tests along the top. That's the counterfactual MSP1, Central 2 and Regional 3. And then all of the possibilities in terms of the networks and the linkages that we would try and do. And obviously this goes into a series of tests, both quantitative and qualitative, and we try and derive a series of outcomes that help us to understand the impact or the benefits and the opportunities that those would all drop out. So this will all be done through a bespoke traffic model that we're developing, and using GIS obviously as part of that to understand the land integration with transport. But obviously a big piece around this is obviously the population growth, and in some cases, obviously for the long-term rail, for example, we may need to test out what is the demand that a population would actually create to actually justify rail. And that might be 100 years from now, where any of that, or 100 years plus, where any of that demand will be sufficient to actually justify. But obviously that's something that obviously, again, we're yet to achieve. So just as a piece, well, as we move out of our long listing, so when we have all of these particular networks derived, we'll be coming to each of the councils, to each of the elected members, and actually presenting the long list again, illustrating to you exactly what those look like. And then obviously a month later we'll be coming to talk to you about what the shortlist is. So what's the analysis showing us? What are the actual elements that we're going to be taking forward into the shortlist, and what does that mean for the region? So there's a series of dates, therefore, that I would like you to note. So we are, as I say, looking to complete the long list this month. That long list would be seeking approval from the Transport Working Group around about the 6th of October. And then between the 6th and the 20th of October, we'd look to come to yourselves and others to talk about what that long list derived. What are the outcomes that we've got from the transport PBC? Then what we'd look to try and do is in mid to late November, come back to you again with the shortlist. What has our analysis shown, and what do we actually think are the best options moving forward? That's in the short, medium, and long term, with the idea that we could confirm the long list by the end of November and look to therefore confirm the recommended way forward by December. Now, this program, obviously taking into account lockdowns, but this program still has a date of the end of April 2022 to provide a completed program business case. And so obviously we've got a lot of work to do between December and April to try and get the economic justification and the costs to actually align with our shortlisting. But obviously that was just to give you a couple of key dates, and I know that hopefully Brian has provided these to you as well. So what I'll probably just do is say that was my last slide. Hopefully I've got through that in about 20 or so minutes. And anybody have any questions?
Can I just say something to you? This is historical, that this has just been fascinating to listen to, because what it really brought to the forefront of my mind was the railway that used to run along the back of our farm out at Newstead, going on into Ruakura. That was the way all the college kids got from Morrinsville and Te Aroha into the Hamilton College. And so it ran twice a day. And so, you know, I'm sort of used to rail, running along and going to school and going shopping. And yeah, I find it fascinating that the wheel is going round again.
It's all a circle. It's all a circle.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. And you know, I feel quite excited by your presentation, because it you know, when you get to the end of it, perhaps I won't be here for the next 100 years, of course, but maybe I can look down and see it all. But I think I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
James, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. You know, you're talking about you're estimating the demand. Like,
yes.
Are you assuming that only a percentage of the population will use this sort of rapid transit option? You know, I'm aware that overseas, you know, you might only get 5% of the population using public transport. Like, have you got some targets that you're putting into your model for that? You know, it's not 100% of the growth, is it?
Absolutely, no. I mean, cars are still going to be part of any solution that we derive. So this isn't going to be suddenly, you know, deleting all cars from the network at all. It will be looking at, absolutely, as you say, a percentage of that new population that would actually make that mode shift across to a public transport mode. And look, we are looking at some national and international examples. Christchurch obviously had a piece of work done recently that I think garnered around 5 to 10% shift. We completed as Oricon the airport to Botany link. That actually demand was around about 30%. So again, obviously, if you have a higher populous area, you get a more of a compact urban form, you can get more people onto public transport. So yeah, we absolutely would agree that, you know, for some of the larger distance journeys from Tiamu and Cambridge into Hamilton, for example, there still will be a need to use cars in some regard, but we're trying to provide that mode choice.
Right. And then have you, obviously, your model seems to be based on capital costs. Like, are you also going to include operating costs? Because
yes.
I noticed that operating costs are almost as much as capital if you take a long-term view. Like, I had a look at an Australian example, and like for the Gold Coast, and over a 30-year period, the operating costs are pretty much as the capital.
Yes, it's true. Both the CapEx and the OpEx costs are included in our total economic evaluation. So obviously, as you say, it's about, for example, if you're building a rail system, you'd have to take account of, you know, putting in signaling, probably doing level crossings that were grade separated, but also then you've still got to purchase the vehicles and then operate the vehicles for a series of years. So yes, so the economic range normally is 30 years, but for a program of this size, we'll actually be trying to do that in a 60-year horizon, which is relatively new, again, through the Waka Kotahi new standards that enables us to do that. But yes, it would have to include both OpEx and CapEx.
Oh yeah, okay. And then just one last sort of plea, I guess, and that is with your scenario definitions, the base case or the business as usual, you use the terminology counterfactual.
Yeah.
And I just find that really a turn off, actually. It's not that it's a bit unfortunate that you're using it, because we're having it with the water reform stuff. And in a way, it's not counterfactual, because it's what's likely to be happening if we just keep on doing what we're doing, you know.
Yeah.
And so I find it rather peculiar that there seems to be fashionable to use the term counterfactual when it used to be the null hypothesis or the base case or the status quo. Yeah.
I think actually it's a slight Americanism. It's been used a lot in the US, but actually it tries to reflect a future which doesn't necessarily have an actual baseline in the existing. So what it's really saying is we're not going to test it to death and trying to work it out. We're really going to a future scenario, as you say, which projects further out. So yes, I completely agree. Counterfactuals are an odd use of phraseology.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Yeah, hello, James. Roger Gordon here. Can you
Roger.
hear me?
I can indeed.
Yeah, lovely. Now, I'm particularly interested in what you're including in terms of Cambridge. Cambridge is the largest population area outside of Hamilton, and it's a high growth area. That
Yes.
LUS3 that you're talking about, the regional nodes, suggests that 60% will be growth within those regional nodes, which possibly is an even higher scenario than what we're looking at currently.
That's right.
But are you looking also at the urban network within that new larger population base that could well be, up to 50,000 people living around Cambridge by that window that you're talking about?
We are, yes. So, this is really not a singularity. So, what we're saying is from the MSP's discussions and obviously from their outcomes, there was a regional growth of only 30%. So we're looking at if that were to double, what effect basically does that have on the place of Cambridge? And therefore, what are the actual services required to facilitate that? Obviously, one of the big questions would be, for example, when it comes to high schools, you've got a single high school at Cambridge. You might have a lot of pupils that travel to Hamilton for their education. So, what are the effects of us providing more effective transport modes for them to get to education in Hamilton? And also, what does it mean to then the landform of Cambridge? What's the intensification within Cambridge itself?
I hope by then we've got another high school, by the way. So
yeah, well, that might also be another way around it.
Wow.
Hi, James. Thanks for your presentation today. It's really great to hear that more is going to be spent on freight. With Ruakura Inland Port and the other industrial areas, because we've got two of the biggest ports north and east of us, and so it's really great that a lot more is going to be invested in that area. That's really going to help with congestion getting up to Auckland with cars and things like that. So it's really great to hear that that's going to happen. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think freight's going to be a very important part, Philip, as the way in which, obviously, again, the maps that I show you on the screen here, this is all residential, but there's obviously a very significant employment piece as well. So obviously you have one of the largest aluminium plants within the boundaries of Waipa. So, those employment zones will still need access for all of their workers as well. So the idea of getting more freight to rail, what it will mean is that those freight hubs will generate more traffic. There'll be smaller vehicles, but obviously there'll be more of your small white vans to actually deliver the goods. But obviously you get the bulk of those heavy goods vehicles off the road and provide for a greater level of safety and a greater level of efficiency when it comes to movement of freight.
Yeah, and then on top of that, of course, we've got the new Expressway, Hamilton Expressway, which is about to be completed, which is right next door to Ruakura, which that'll help complement each other with the rail and roading and traffic coming from the east and west, freight coming from the west as well. So
that's right.
Like that too. So that's really great. And just along with Cambridge, I mean, with the expressway, the Cambridge Expressway that opened, was it 6 or 7 years ago now? Our traffic numbers coming through town are higher now than when the expressway was open. But the thing is, we haven't got the trucks coming through Cambridge too. So they're going on the bypass. Majority of them are.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you'll still require a need to service your town centres. So obviously there will still be some movement of freight into the town centres, but obviously there is no reason for there to be B trains and very large heavy goods vehicles within those areas. But obviously that's the thing that we're looking at now. What are the opportunities for us to move a lot of that away from the vulnerable areas and obviously use freight hubs to actually get the large bulk movement by freight by rail.
Yeah.
James, Mike Pettit speaking. Oh, sorry, Philip, that you finished.
Well, yeah, okay. So thanks, Mike. Sorry, this is a bit of a big one, really, but with passenger rail up to Auckland from Hamilton, thinking really long term, with the Hamilton Airport. So, Hamilton Waikato's really central to 3 of the biggest tourist attractions in the country, with Waitomo, Rotorua, and Hobbiton.
Yeah.
This is out there, but would there, if you're going to do a high-speed railway to Hamilton to Auckland, could that link with the Hamilton Airport and Auckland Airport, and potentially Hamilton Airport being an international airport for 1 or 2 airlines, Asian airlines particularly, that would target coming to those tourist attractions in the future, and linking them up with the Auckland City and the airport, Auckland Airport and Hamilton Airport?
I don't know what the aspirations for Hamilton Airport are as yet. We have a series of discussions with them over the next couple of weeks. My understanding is that obviously there were previously international flights, but those have now been discontinued. Certainly, as part of the Hamilton to Auckland rail connection, the work that's being done by the MOT presently only looks at it as a Hamilton to Auckland. So it actually, I think, adopts Rotokauri as the key hub, and then obviously the next stop would be Drury. Obviously, what we're looking at here is the abilities for us to tap into that connection. If that connection were to come down east of Taupiri, for example, what would it mean to us to be able to actually take rail around Hamilton? And as you suggest, there might be an opportunity for us to connect to a freight hub or something at the airport, and or obviously this would provide for both passenger and or freight anyway. So yeah, I mean, I think there's opportunities there, Philip, to understand what the impacts might be on the landform, but also what it might do for some of the existing land uses in those locations. So airport would be one of them.
Okay. Oh, thanks, James. Anyway,
thank you, Philip.
Yeah, hi, James. Mike Pettit speaking. It's just a sort of just a question around page 13 of your presentation, and it's just with so many modes of transport, with the cycling and the vehicles and the buses, and that medium long-term sort of view, just 34 meters, or 34, what is it, 26 meters of transport corridor to cross. Is that zebra crossing type stuff, or is that underpass to get from one side to the other? Like, just that, how does the transport keep moving?
Yeah, so I mean, in the majority, obviously, at any intersection there would have to be traffic signals. None of these rights of way will be able to function without it. We would consider obviously grade separation, obviously in some heavy trafficked areas as well. But for the most part, I guess it's worth looking at these as opportunities within some of the existing corridors, as well as possibility of providing new. So if I think about Waiwiri Drive, I think about Te Rapa Road, there's a very wide designation in a lot of those areas that you could provide something of this nature without necessarily creating a significant new investment. But yes, completely take your point. I mean, obviously, to cross, for a pedestrian to cross for this, there obviously is going to be a significant need for us to ensure that pedestrian access, particularly for the public transport use as well. As soon as a passenger gets off a bus, they become a pedestrian. So that's something there we have to ensure that we get access is correct. But yes, it's definitely something we need to look at.
Thank you, James.
May I ask another question? It seems that the rail service to Te Awamutu, the train used to stop there. That the one that goes from Auckland to Wellington. But I wondered if you'd looked at that to get that cracking perhaps a bit sooner in your plan. Because the lines are already there. The parking for cars is already there. Could you do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something we're looking at. The reuse of the existing system. What would be the cost to get it to actually be able to function as an appropriate, and I'll use this phrase lightly, but metro service. So, what are the opportunities for us to link Te Awamutu to Auckland using that existing line? What upgrades are needed? What carriages or what rolling stock is required to use it as well, and what's therefore the demand for people. So as one of the people mentioned earlier, there will only be percentage of the total population that will actually want to use public transport. Now we're trying to push that percentage up, but obviously we're also aware that obviously cars will continue to be a competing mode. But it's certainly something we're looking at. Now, whether or not that is feasible in the short to medium term, that's obviously still for us to do the analysis of. But certainly that's one of the options we're looking at, Councillor Barnes, yes.
Yeah, James, thank you very much. Lou Brown here from Te Ameru. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just looking at what you're suggesting, and I think there's a great amount of information to accept here. One of the things is modern technology is transiting and changing rapidly at the moment. And we're just looking at things like, rail and things like this. Are they considering things like monorail as they do overseas, or something where you can input infrastructure in without widening the roads, and you can have this rapid transit without actually relying it directly onto the roads and be able to move around? Because I think that we're stuck with the fact that a lot of our roads were designed 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and they're quite narrow, and we might have to look at other types of infrastructure.
Yeah, technology is definitely something we're looking at, Lou. One of the things there is that I use the phrase rapid transit on the basis that it doesn't hopefully convey a specific type. So it's not a train, it's not a bus. So it's the idea of what option would we actually be able to create. And obviously monorails and those grade separated rail systems do have some issues around obviously the height of them, and obviously the change therefore it will have in terms of the character of the space in which you put those things. But it doesn't preclude us actually looking at a vast gambit of different opportunities here, and we're obviously looking at the demand approach, but also the place. What does the place need to be to actually make those things work as well? So yeah, certainly something, Lou, that is in the mix.
Thank you very much.
James, Jim Milcrease here. Just in terms of all of these proposals, they're obviously growth driven, and for them to be affordable. So I suppose in terms of the really long term picture, has any modelling been done on what the world population is likely to be doing at that time, and what we're actually looking at as an optimum population for New Zealand, and at what point does this become actually affordable?
Yeah, I think the affordability question is a really important one, Jim. And it is something that we're taking exceedingly seriously. So, as I said to you before, the issue around something such as this long-term rail outcome, it will really be around either two things. One is a significant steer by central government that the investment in rail is a priority, and they're obviously going to pay for it. Or the second one is it's a demand outcome. So how many years down the track do we need to be to actually make the demand feasible to pay for it all? So, in a ridiculous situation, does it need to be that Cambridge is 150,000 people or 200,000 people to therefore get that demand sufficient to afford to get that system? So, what we're trying to do here is think, yes, we've got a 100-year vision for this particular piece. But obviously, there might be something after that particular piece that we also need to consider as well. So, yeah, there's a lot here around matching both demand and the idea of mode choice to actually get you an economic justification. Because each of the outcomes as part of the program business case will be to get a justification of this program in economic terms. That is.
James.
Thanks.
Roger here again. That 100-year time frame is incredible, really, isn't it? I mean, in terms of the medium to long-term option that you've talked about, everything that you've used in there are really existing and traditional forms of transport.
That's right. So
what's going to happen in technology in that 100 years? We could well be looking at, I don't know, fly through the sky or whatever it is on a consumer basis. The rate of change is so fast. How are you going to really look at those different scenarios that could possibly occur in that 100-year timeframe?
It is a challenging one. Obviously, the rate of change, as you say, I'm not suggesting that we'll be teleporting between places just yet. But the idea, obviously, is that we're trying to understand the impact that that these transport modes would have, and therefore the benefit that it might derive to help you change the land use. So, you know, all of the options that we're kind of considering here, for example, around any bus, light rail, or rail, they would all be electrified. There wouldn't be any diesel usage in those. We are looking, and we'll be looking to technology for other outcomes as well. But for example, we've continued to discuss the place that even e-bikes have managed to change in terms of the way in which people get around on those now. If you look at the northwestern cycle track, which runs down past basically from Coatesville down to Auckland, I think it's about 26 kilometers. I think there's 5,500 people a day cycle 26 kilometers into the city for either business or I'm guessing some do it for pleasure, but particularly for business. So, that itself has changed a significant amount of the way in which people move. So technology will be something we look at continuously through, as you say, this very long lens of what does 100 years really do? Because yes, I mean, I'm not confirming that in 100 years we're necessarily going to get it right.
Thank you, James. I'm just aware that we've run over time and the next workshop item needs to start. So there's been some great conversation there. And just remember, councillors, that we're going to have opportunity to come back and revisit and ask a few more questions in the next couple of months. So if you didn't get a question in today and you've still got it, make a note and there'll be plenty of opportunity in the near future. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, James.